Look up. Don't glance. Commit. Let your neck tilt until the street disappears and the sky becomes a narrow corridor between masonry and disbelief. There it is, a blade of architecture. A triangular prow cutting into Manhattan's air. So sharp, it feels less like a building and more like a dare. From this angle, the Flatiron doesn't simply stand, it advances. It leans into your imagination like a ship surging forward. Its stone skin taut over a steel skeleton. Its point so thin, you almost expect it to whistle. And now add the sound New Yorkers couldn't ignore even when they tried. Wind hard. City wind funneling through the avenue canyons. Accelerating, screaming. Turning the intersection into a stage where physics and gossip perform together. This is the cruel joke of modernity. Sometimes a masterpiece is born not from admiration, but from the public's hunger to see it fail. Because in the earliest days when the Flatiron first rose above 23rd Street, like a wedge hammered into the grid, people did not gather here to applaud genius. They gathered to witness a collapse. Not metaphorical collapse, literal collapse. The kind that scatters stone into the street. The kind that proves a new century is still governed by old instincts, suspicion, superstition, delight at disaster as long as it happens to someone else. The city was loud with certainty. A building shaped like this had no right to survive. Too narrow, too strange, too thin at the tip, a knife balanced on its edge, a skyscraper that looked like it had been drawn by mistake and built out of arrogance. And when a crowd believes something will fall, it begins to treat the fall as entertainment. The language turns theatrical. The predictions grow colorful. The fear becomes a game. So imagine the corner in the early 1900s as a living rumor. Broadway slicing diagonally through Manhattan's disciplined grid. Fifth Avenue insisting on its own prestige. 23rd Street acting as the hinge where money, fashion, and traffic collided. And right there, caught between competing streets like a piece of paper trapped in a closing door, was the land itself, a wedge-shaped plot. Awkward, stubborn, almost mocking. It was the kind of parcel that made practical men shake their heads and walk away. Build what, they would ask. Build where? The geometry itself seemed hostile. If you believed in cursed ground, you would swear this was it. A sliver of earth that the city's clean rectangles could not swallow. Then someone decided to build anyway. That is always how the next era announces itself, by refusing the laughter of the old one. A new kind of architect, a new kind of calculation, a new kind of audacity. New York had seen tall buildings before, but the Flatiron's shape made height feel like provocation. It didn't merely rise, it pointed. Its narrow face turned the city into an audience, and when it began to climb, the public responded the way crowds often respond to the unfamiliar, not with curiosity, but with ridicule sharpened into prophecy. They called it folly. They called it madness. They called it the kind of Chicago bravado that didn't understand New York's winds, New York's weight, New York's merciless appetite for embarrassment. The implication was simple. This outsider idea would be punished by the city's invisible judge, the air itself. Now picture the scene the way a voiceover should. Not like a tidy history lesson, but like a thriller told in daylight. A cluster of men on the sidewalk. Hats tipped back. Eyes narrowed upward. Waiting, not for beauty, for proof. Proof that the world still behaves the way they expect. Proof that rules exist and that rule breakers get crushed. Some of them are construction watchers, the old breed who treat building sites like theater. Some are businessmen lingering on their lunch break, half amused, half uneasy. Some are bookies and cynics who can turn any prediction into profit. And yes, in the story that circulates around this corner like a persistent gust, there are even bets not only whether the building will fall, but how far the debris will fly when it does. It's morbid, it's absurd, and it's perfectly human because the crowd loves a spectacle most when it can pretend the spectacle is inevitable. The Flatiron's point becomes the focal point of a city-wide superstition. If the wind hits it the wrong way, it will go down. If a storm arrives with the right fury, it will crumple. The building becomes less a structure and more a test of the modern world's bravest claim, that steel frames can tame air, that engineering can overrule instinct, that a shape that looks impossible can still be correct. But crowds don't think in calculations. Crowds think in images, and the image of a triangular tower, thin as a blade at one end, felt like an insult to common sense. The Flatiron didn't look safe. It looked like it was daring the sky to take a swing. And that is why the hook works, because the Flatiron begins as a public expectation of disaster. You can almost feel the city's secret desire in it. The desire to watch a symbol break. The desire to say, "We told you so," and feel temporarily powerful against progress. The desire to turn someone else's ambition into a cautionary tale you can enjoy from the sidewalk. The Flatiron, at birth, is not an icon. It is a target. But the most interesting part of this story is not that people doubted it. People always doubt what interrupts their patterns. The interesting part is what the doubt reveals. The crowd's relationship to difference. Because here, on this corner, New York shows you its oldest reflex, its ability to turn suspicion into sport, and sport into culture. The building doesn't merely rise into the skyline, it rises into the city's imagination, where mockery and fascination are often the same emotion in different clothes. People come to see it because they hate it. Then they come to see it because they can't stop thinking about it. Then, without noticing the transition, they come because the building has turned the intersection into a phenomenon, an event that repeats every day. So hold this opening image in your mind. The Flatiron's prow above you. Wind sharpening as it slides along the avenues. A crowd below with faces tilted upward, waiting for gravity to win. The city thinks it is watching a future catastrophe. In reality, it is witnessing something else, the birth of a legend. Not a legend built on admiration, but on obsession. An obsession in New York is often stronger than love. To understand why the Flatiron terrified people, you have to understand the land beneath it, because the story begins not with an architect's ego, but with a geometric accident. Manhattan is famous for its grid. That confident checkerboard laid across the island as if the city could be disciplined by straight lines. The grid is New York's promise of order, but Broadway is the city's refusal. It cuts diagonally through that order like a knife through paper. An older road that predates the grid and never agreed to obey it. When Broadway meets Fifth Avenue near 23rd Street, the grid doesn't solve the intersection. It breaks. It produces a sliver of space that looks like a mistake the city forgot to erase. A wedge-shaped parcel, sharp at one end, wider at the other, almost insulting in its awkwardness. For decades, that wedge was the kind of urban problem nobody wanted. It was too narrow for conventional buildings, too prominent to be ignored. Its triangular shape turned every floor plan into a compromise. The streets around it were busy, prestigious, and increasingly valuable. The Ladies' Mile shopping district nearby drew wealth, fashion, and attention. Traffic flowed in complicated currents. The plot sat at the hinge of commerce and spectacle, exactly the kind of place where a building could either become a triumph or a punchline. Then came the modern equation: high land value plus limited footprint equals vertical ambition. The logic was not romantic, it was mathematical. If the ground is scarce, you build upward. And by the early 1900s, New York was learning how to do this in a new language: steel. The steel frame was the quiet revolution that made skyscrapers possible. It shifted the burden from thick, load-bearing walls to an internal skeleton that could carry weight with elegant efficiency. Stone could become clothing, not muscle. Height could become less a brute force pile of masonry and more a calculated act of engineering. Enter Daniel Burnham, an architect from Chicago, which matters more than it sounds. New York, at that time, carried a certain cultural arrogance about itself. Chicago was rising fast, modern, practical, sometimes brash. New York was older, richer, and convinced it owned sophistication. An outsider arriving with a new structural logic could feel like a provocation. Burnham's approach belonged to the emerging industrial age. Rational, engineered, unapologetically modern. He didn't try to make the wedge behave like a normal plot. He leaned into its strangeness. He decided to make the wedge the point, the literal point of the building's identity. And that decision is what created the psychological shock. Because a triangular building doesn't just occupy a corner. It announces the corner. It turns the intersection into a stage where the building becomes the performer. The Flatiron would not be something you pass. It would be something you confront. Its form was composed with a classical seriousness that almost feels ironic, given the public's ridicule. Burnham wasn't building a joke. He was building a kind of modern column base. Shaft, capital, an old architectural grammar stretched into a new urban vertical. At street level, the building presented a strong base, grounded and substantial, as if to argue against the fear of collapse. Above, it rose in steady rhythm, its facade reading like a disciplined stack of windows and stonework, a uniformity that was meant to reassure this is not a wild thing, it is ordered. But the prow, the prow. That razor-thin tip was the insult to common sense. People heard measurements and still didn't believe them. The point was so narrow it sounded like a rumor. A man could stand at the tip and stretch his arms and touch the walls on both sides. That's not an architectural detail, it's an image that sticks in the brain like a splinter. It makes the building feel like a trick. It makes you wonder how anyone could work inside it. How furniture could fit. How people could live with such a strange compression of space. And then, because humans translate form into feeling, the building's shape produced a sense of motion. It looked like it was moving forward. Buildings usually feel planted. The Flatiron felt directional. Its wedge implied momentum, as if the city itself were being cut by this new object. That perceived motion fed the public's anxiety. If a building feels like it's leaning, you begin to imagine it falling even if it's perfectly stable. The Flatiron became a psychological experiment. Could a city accept a new form without inventing a catastrophe? But the real secret, the one the crowd could not see from the sidewalk, was that the building's modern stability came from its invisible bones. The steel skeleton made it stronger than it looked. The stone facade was not the thing holding it up. It was the suit that made the steel palatable to a public that still trusted masonry more than metallurgy. Burnham's outsider logic was not reckless, it was calculated. He was betting on modern engineering to outperform old instinct. And the city responded the way it often responds to what it doesn't yet understand. It framed the unfamiliar as danger. New Yorkers didn't say, "This is new. Let's learn." They said, "This is new. It will die." They named it with the glee of premature victory, Burnham's Folly. The nickname carried a promise of humiliation. It was not enough to doubt. The crowd wanted the building to fail in a way that would confirm their superiority. It's a small, ugly, human impulse when you can't control the future. It feels good to imagine the future punishing someone else. But here is where the story begins to twist. Because the Flatiron did not collapse. The wind did not knock it over. The city's prophecy did not come true. And when a prophecy fails, it doesn't simply disappear, it mutates. Instead of becoming a ruin, the Flatiron became a machine, not a machine for falling, but a machine for shaping the air. Its wedge did what wedges do. It redirected forces. And the force it redirected was the one that had been cast as its executioner. The wind didn't destroy the Flatiron. The Flatiron weaponized the wind. The city's first fear was simple. The Flatiron would fall. That fear had the clean satisfaction of a single dramatic outcome. One storm, one collapse, one moment of rubble and vindication. But New York did not get the disaster it expected. Instead, it received something stranger, more theatrical, and in some ways more perfect for a city addicted to spectacle. The building did not break under the wind. It bent the wind into mischief. Because the Flatiron's shape, so shocking to the eye, was also a shape that could confuse the air. Manhattan streets are already wind machines. Tall buildings create corridors where gusts accelerate, turning calm weather into sudden violence at the corners. Air doesn't like obstacles, it likes to slip around them, squeeze through gaps, rush into open space. When you introduce a wedge into that system, when you place a prow at the collision point of major avenues, you don't just add another building. You add a blade that slices airflow into new patterns. Here is the simplest way to see it. The Flatiron became an amplifier. When wind struck the narrow prow, it compressed. Compression accelerates. The air sped up, then curled, then dropped. It funneled down toward the street in sudden bursts, gusts that felt like invisible punches. It wasn't the kind of wind that gently pushes. It was the kind that surprises you. The kind that grabs the edge of a coat and snaps it. The kind that makes pedestrians stumble half a step and look around as if someone had shoved them. The building didn't collapse. The air did something theatrical instead. It turned the intersection into a stage for chaos. Imagine the corner at street level on a blustery day in the early 1900s. Men in stiff collars adjusting hats that won't stay put. Women navigating heavy skirts, trying to keep composure in a culture where composure was armor. Shopkeepers watching their window displays tremble. The city moving in its usual rhythm until a gust arrives like an ambush. Hats lift, coattails whip, loose papers become birds. The wind, sudden and violent, seems to erupt from nowhere, as if the building is exhaling, and then the stories begin. They always begin that way, small incidents turning into urban folklore. A carriage jolts at the wrong moment and the horse spooks. A cart tips a fraction too far. A storefront window cracks under pressure or under flying debris. People laugh because laughter is the city's reflex against discomfort. People swear because swearing is the city's reflex against humiliation. And above it all, the Flatiron stands perfectly indifferent. Its stone face, not even acknowledging the commotion it seems to create. This is the struggle of the episode. And it's an elegant one because it's ironic. The building becomes famous not because it fails, but because it changes the environment around it. New Yorkers came to watch it fall. When it refused, they stayed to watch what it did. The intersection began to develop a personality. It wasn't just a busy corner anymore, it was a place with a reputation. Careful there, people would warn, half joking, the wind will get you. The Flatiron's prow became a kind of urban weather vane, not measuring the wind, but summoning it. And because the building was so visually dramatic, the wind behavior felt like proof of something supernatural, or at least something cursed. People love when physics looks like a haunting. The idea that the building caused the wind felt more satisfying than the truth that the building simply reshaped airflow in a city already full of it. This is what made the Flatiron a cultural object so fast. It wasn't merely architecture. It was a phenomenon. It produced stories. It generated scenes. And those scenes attracted crowds the way a fire attracts a street. But there's another layer. The Flatiron's wind didn't just create inconvenience. It created opportunities for attention. New York is a city that monetizes curiosity. If something strange happens in public, it becomes entertainment. If it happens repeatedly, it becomes a tradition. And if it happens at a fashionable intersection near shopping districts, near the social circuits of the day, it becomes a magnet for a certain kind of crowd. The same people who once came for collapse now came for something else, the thrill of being near the edge of disorder while still feeling safe. You can see the social mechanics forming. The corner becomes a place to linger, to watch, to laugh, to point, to pretend you're simply passing through when you are, in fact, waiting for the next gust. A wind tunnel doesn't sound romantic until it becomes a stage for human behavior. And at the Flatiron, the stage was perfect. A prow pointing forward, a stream of traffic flowing like water, an air rushing down like an invisible curtain that could rise at any moment. That is the key. Unpredictability. The wind didn't perform on schedule. It struck when it wanted. That randomness made it addictive. People returned because they wanted to be present for the moment something happened. In a sense, the Flatiron Corner offered a free spectacle, one that required no ticket. Only time and an appetite for watching strangers react. And in that appetite, the episode begins to sharpen toward its darkest satire. Because what the wind did next, what the crowd did next, would reveal the city's less flattering instincts. The Flatiron stopped being a rumor about physics and became a rumor about bodies. The building's wedge created a phenomenon. The phenomenon created a crowd. The crowd created a culture. And culture, especially in a city like New York, always finds the quickest route to voyeurism. The street is public. The weather is public. And suddenly, a gust can become an excuse for a certain kind of gaze. New York will forgive almost anything if it can turn it into a show. That is the city's talent and its curse. It converts fear into entertainment, and entertainment into habit. By the time the Flatiron proved it would not collapse, the public mood shifted from disappointment to improvisation. If the building refused to provide rubble, the city would find a different kind of spectacle beneath it. And the wind, faithful to its role as the Flatiron's invisible accomplice, delivered the trigger. Because the gusts at 23rd Street didn't just knock off hats. They didn't just slap coats and send scraps of paper spiraling into the air. They did something far more socially explosive in the moral climate of the early 1900s. They lifted fabric. This is one of those historical moments that feels ridiculous until you remember how strict the social codes were. In that era, female respectability was policed through clothing. Modesty was not only a personal virtue, it was public performance, enforced by gossip and consequence. A woman's ankle could be treated as scandalous. A glimpse of stalking could be framed as indecent. The body was not simply a body, it was a moral battleground. And now imagine a corner where the wind repeatedly and without warning tried to tear that performance open. The Ladies' Mile shopping district nearby filled the streets with women moving through public space shopping, strolling, living yet still expected to carry the burden of appearing proper at all times. When the Flatiron's downdrafts struck, skirts could billow, hemlines could snap upward. Composure could be threatened in a second. For the women affected, it was humiliation by weather public. Involuntary, and impossible to prevent. You can't argue with a gust. You can only clutch your skirt and pray the street is not full of eyes. But the street was full of eyes, and the city's eyes, especially the male gaze of that period, did what it often does when given permission by circumstance. It gathered. Here, the story turns from engineering into sociology, from the physics of airflow into the physics of crowds. Men began to congregate at the corner not because they expected a building to fall, but because they expected a skirt to lift. The phenomenon became predictable enough to be hunted, yet random enough to be exciting. That mix is addictive. Certainty that something will happen, uncertainty about exactly when. It transformed a public intersection into a hunting ground for a certain kind of curiosity, one that pretended to be harmless because it was just the wind. But it wasn't just the wind. It was the wind plus intention. It was the wind as an excuse for what people wanted to do anyway, stare without consequence. And because this was New York, the crowd multiplied. A few men loitering becomes dozens. Dozens become a regular gathering. The sidewalk becomes an audience. The corner becomes famous for the wrong reason. The Flatiron, born as a rumored disaster, evolved into something even more revealing, a mirror held up to the city's appetite. Picture the scene in cinematic detail. It's late afternoon, traffic clatters and hisses horses, wheels, voices. The building's prow throws a long shadow across the street like the bow of a ship. Women pass through the intersection, focused on errands, conversation, the rhythm of the city. And then, suddenly, a gust hits hard and surgical rising under fabric like a cruel hand. A skirt flares, stocking flashes, A woman stiffens, grabs, blushes or glares, and the crowd waiting, watching reacts with that particular noise a crowd makes when it gets what it came for, laughter mixed with shouts. The ugly sound of triumph, disguised as fun. If this is the climax because it reveals the story's central satire. The Flatiron becomes a cultural landmark not only because it was architecturally daring, but because it accidentally produced a recurring moment of public indecency, an indecency created by wind and exploited by people. The building's most notorious early effect was not collapse. It was a spectacle of embarrassment. And where there is a crowd and embarrassment, there is the inevitable next actor in the city's drama, the police. Authorities were forced to intervene, not because a building was unstable, but because the sidewalk had become a gathering of voyeurs. This is the bitter comedy of it. The city needed officers to manage not an engineering hazard, but human behavior. They had to push men back. They had to break up the lingering. They had to restore a version of public order that wasn't being threatened by riots or crime, but by the everyday predation of staring. Now imagine the enforcement not as a clean solution, but as another spectacle. A policeman steps forward, baton, visible, not even as a weapon, but as a symbol of the state's impatience. He shouts, he gestures. The men laugh and scatter a few feet, only to drift back when the officer turns his head. It becomes a street ballet. Gust, glance, laugh, shove, repeat. And from this repeated pattern, this ritual of being chased away from 23rd Street, emerges a phrase with the brisk efficiency of slang, 23 Skidoo. In other words, move along, get out. Don't linger here. The phrase itself carries the whole episode's irony like a punchline, a major American slang expression born not from war, not from politics, but from a corner where architecture made wind. Wind made a crowd, and the crowd made the police tired. It's almost too perfect. The city took a new building, turned it into a scandal, then turned the scandal into vocabulary. And the Flatiron, silent above it all, did what great urban symbols often do. It absorbed the stories. It collected them like soot. Every joke, every nickname, every rumor of collapse, every whisper of indecency, layer by layer, attached itself to the building until the building became inseparable from its myth. That is how cultural icons are made, not only by form, but by the human behavior the form provokes. So by the end of this climax, something important has happened. The crowd's original relationship to the Flatiron has been reversed. They no longer come primarily to watch the building die. They come because the building has become the center of a weird, distinctly New York microculture, equal parts awe, mockery, and moral mess. The Flatiron has stopped being an object. It has become an event. The most humiliating thing a city can do to a new idea is laugh at it. New York has always been fluent in that humiliation. It laughs as a defense mechanism, a way to pretend it is not impressed, a way to keep power in the hands of the familiar. But the city has another habit, equally strong and far more dangerous for the cynics. It falls in love with what it cannot stop looking at. And the Flatiron mocked, doubted, used as a stage for vulgar curiosity, did the one thing that ruins ridicule. It refused to go away. It stood day after day, through seasons that wrung the avenues with wind, through storms that would have delighted the pessimists, through the ordinary punishment of time. The building simply remained. Its steel frame did what modern engineering promised it would do. Its stone and terracotta skin held its composure. The prow that felt impossible became familiar. The city's nervous system adjusted. The jokes lost their bite. The Folly nickname began to sound less like prophecy and more like evidence that New York's first reaction is often wrong. And then, without any official ceremony, something subtle happened. The Flatiron became a landmark in the oldest New York way through repetition. People used it as a meeting point. I'll see you at the Triangle. People oriented themselves by it. They gave directions with it. They looked for it the way sailors look for a lighthouse. A building that was once treated like a mistake became a point of certainty in the city's chaos. This is where the resonance becomes more than architectural history. The Flatiron did not become iconic because it was the biggest or the tallest. It became iconic because it was unmistakable. In a skyline full of rectangles, it was a blade. In a city that worships scale, it achieved prominence through shape. It proved a lesson that New York, reluctantly, has had to learn again and again. The most memorable things are not always the most powerful. They are the most specific. Think of the building as a personality. It has a profile you can recognize in silhouette. It has a face that changes depending on where you stand. From one angle, it looks wide, almost conventional. From another, it becomes a thin line, shocking in its narrowness. It is never the same building twice, because your position changes, and the city's streets force you to encounter it from different perspectives. That variability gives it cinematic quality. It behaves like a prop designed to be photographed, and photographed it was before the Chrysler Building crowned itself with Art Deco lightning, before the Empire State Building became America's vertical anthem. The Flatiron was already everywhere, especially in the era of postcards. The early 20th century was an age of mass imagery. People mailed cities to each other like souvenirs. Postcards were the social media of their day. And the Flatiron's silhouette was perfect for that medium dramatic, modern, instantly readable. You didn't need a caption to know where you were. The building's outline was the caption. But here's the deeper irony. The Flatiron became a symbol, not because it was designed to represent the city, but because the city couldn't stop talking about it. It became famous as a controversy first. The ridicule created attention. The attention created myth. The myth created repetition. And repetition created inevitability. This is how New York often makes its icons, by trying to reject them, and then discovering rejection only sharpened the public's fixation. Even the wind, originally imagined as executioner, became part of the brand. The corner's gusts were inconvenient, yes, but they also gave the place a pulse. They made it a site of drama. They turned an intersection into a story. And a city lives on stories more than it lives on stone. Tourists, photographers, artists, newspapers, all of them fed on the building's personality. The Flatiron wasn't merely a structure. It was a character in the city's ongoing narrative about modern life, spectacle, and the public's relationship to both. And the scandal, too, left residue. The 23rd Street spectacle, the gawkers, the police, the shouted slang became part of the building's folklore. That's what makes the Flatiron such a perfect episode-ending symbol. It contains both the heroic and the ridiculous. It demonstrates that modernity arrives with dignity and with absurdity. It shows you that the city's reaction to innovation is rarely pure admiration. It is a mixture of fear, mockery, fascination, and opportunism. The Flatiron didn't inspire one clean emotion. It inspired a messy crowd, which is to say it inspired New York. So when we say the ship that never sailed, we aren't only describing its wedge shape like a prow cutting the air. We are describing how it moved through culture. A ship sails by pushing through resistance. The Flatiron pushed through resistance made of laughter and doubt. It kept moving, not physically, but symbolically until the resistance became part of its wake. The city's skepticism did not sink it. It polished it. Every insult became proof that the building mattered enough to be insulted. This is the episode's core message. And it lands like a quiet moral at the end of a loud story, to become a symbol. You do not need to be the tallest. You do not need to be the richest. You do not need to be universally liked. You need only to be so different, so undeniably yourself that people cannot look away. New York pretends it despises the unfamiliar, but it eventually crowns the unfamiliar if it survives long enough. And the Flatiron survived. More than that, it endured with style. It outlasted the jokes. It outlasted the gawkers. It outlasted the era that birthed it. And now, over a century later, it remains one of the city's most photographed buildings, still doing what it did at the beginning, taking a chaotic intersection and turning it into a focal point. If you stood on that corner in 1902 beneath the Flatiron's prow, with the wind tugging at your coat and the crowd's laughter rising like steam, you might have believed you were watching a joke being erected in stone. You might have joined the chorus of certainty. It will fall. It must fall. The city cannot allow something this strange to stand. New York loves to pretend it is the final judge of taste. And the quickest verdict it knows how to deliver is ridicule. But history has a habit of embarrassing crowds. The Flatiron did not collapse into rubble. It did not become a cautionary tale. It became the opposite, a monument to endurance. An object lesson in how modern engineering can outlive old instincts. And that endurance did something subtle to the city's ego. It forced New York to confront a truth it hates admitting. Sometimes the crowd is not wise. Only loud. Sometimes common sense is just a costume for fear. Sometimes the thing that looks impossible is simply unfamiliar. That is why this episode makes the perfect final note for the first 5. It completes a sequence of New York icons by revealing a consistent theme across them. These buildings and places are not just achievements of design, they are fortresses built against something. In episode 1, you saw how wealth builds itself palaces to prove permanence. In episode 2, you saw how ambition rises into the sky and tries to defeat time. In episode 3, you saw a fortress of privilege that couldn't keep darkness out. In episode 4, you saw a paradise manufactured through erasure. And now, in episode 5, you see the city's public psyche laid bare. New York's instinct to mock what it doesn't understand, and its slow, inevitable surrender to what it can't ignore. The Flatiron is a ship that never sailed. Yes, but it still carved a wake. It carved it through the air with its prow, through the skyline with its silhouette, through culture with its myths. It turned an awkward wedge of land into a landmark. It turned wind into folklore. It turned a crowd's hunger for disaster into a different hunger, the hunger to be near something that feels alive. And then there is the final, deliciously cynical twist. The Flatiron didn't just attract admiration. It attracted behavior. The same corner where people once waited for collapse became a corner where people waited for embarrassment, where gusts and skirts and gawking created a street ritual so notorious the police had to push it back into the shadows. Out of that ridiculous clash between architecture, weather, and desire came a phrase that carried the city's mood in 2 sharp words, 23 Skidoo, move along, don't linger. Don't make the street your private theater. It is almost poetic in its ugliness. The Flatiron, intended as a serious, modern building, accidentally helped generate a moment of cultural vulgarity, and the city, as always, turned even that into legend. That is New York's true genius. It doesn't just create monuments. It creates stories around them. Stories that often reveal more about people than about stone. So here is the closing voiceover. You end on the one that leaves the viewer with both awe and a smirk. They laughed at it. They bet on its death. They accused it of defying physics. They used it as a stage for crude curiosity. And through all of it, this triangular ship of stone stayed upright, unmoved, almost indifferent, like an elegant insult to the crowd's certainty. The Flatiron teaches New York a lesson it never wants to learn. The different will be mocked first, then photographed, then finally inevitably crowned. To become an icon, you don't need to be the biggest. You only need to be so unmistakably strange that the city cannot erase you, cannot forget you, cannot stop looking. And now, the first arc ends. 5 icons, 5 masks of the same city. But New York, as you already suspect, hides stranger monsters in its pockets, stories that feel less like architecture and more like curses. Because the next chapter is not about a building that almost fell. It is about a structure that did fall on the people who tried to build it. A bridge so ambitious it devoured its creator. A project that turned engineering into tragedy, and tragedy into legend.